Hello, this is Benjamin Lubzik. This is my case study presentation on Edward Snowden. This guy, Edward Snowden, he's working at the U.S. National Security Agency, the NSA, as a contractor. And while he's working there, he finds out a bunch of high-level secret information within the American intelligence area, or whatever you want to call that. And through this information, he finds some of the sketchy things that are occurring within it, such as documents regarding the FISC wanting Verizon to hand over all the call data from Americans to agencies like the FBI and NSA, which then they can then use to go ahead and find the bad guys, or whatever you want to call that, help fight terrorism, stuff among that nature. But the thing is with this call data, this is everything and not just like, oh, they have a warrant for information on this bad guy and they want his phone call information so they can then go through that and get more things to back themselves up. So this essentially means that these agencies are going through the process without a warrant of taking the information, the private information of Americans' call data, without any warrant for information so they can then use that to maybe do more with it. But this is, of course, behind the backs of any Americans truly knowing what is going on and knowing that their call data is being viewed by agents that have no reason to be looking at it because they're innocent or may have like some far off, disconnected connection to a possible bad guy. Now, with this leakage of information that Edward Snowden released, of course, he had to leave the country because he could obviously be filed for espionage acts and a couple different forms of felonies, essentially, that would be on his record. So he fled to Hong Kong, sent this information to two news agencies, The Guardian and The Washington Post. They took this information and slowly over time started releasing it more and more, creating a large fiasco for the NSA and anything else connected to it because it's a massive breach of information. That's the main background information that needs to be known regarding the Edward Snowden case. And now from the story, there's some moral questions that can be raised from this. First of all, was it ethical for Snowden to release these documents? It's a question of, are the pros greater than the cons? With the pros being, okay, the American people know what their government is doing and know that their government is crossing the line in these regards. But the cons is that Snowden leaked a bunch of highly classified information that can now be accessed by enemies of America and those who wish to do something more with it that's nefarious of sorts. Now, another question that this raises is the balance between privacy and security. Because in one hand, you can say that the American government obtaining more or having more free access to a large amount of information will have a better time going ahead, taking this information piece by piece and being able to keep the American people safe. But how much privacy should one give up to allow the government to essentially free roam through your own data? On one hand, you could be optimistic about it and say, okay, the American government will actually use this information for good. But in a more cynical look at it, you can think of it as us slowly getting closer and closer to this dystopian idea of like Big Brother always watching us through our information, keeping track, and then allowing more areas for the government to have control. Similar in a sense to, say, China, where it's known for their government to have strong control over its internet and over the data of its citizens and what they view. With the exposure of this information, it can be found that there are some rules broken and some tensions that were caused from this. First of all, you have the Fourth Amendment, which protects the American people from the government using excessive force, requiring a warrant, and so forth to go sue. So if I were to read the Fourth Amendment, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, house, papers, effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated and no warrants shall issue. but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched, the persons or things to be seized. So what the government is doing is essentially breaking the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution by overstepping its boundaries into people's personal information. It can be agreed that a phone call between two people is a form of personal information, a private piece of information between you and that person, meant just for those two ears to hear. And it's not something that the government should be willingly going into and seizing your information. Now, another thing to also look at is the tensions that were raised from this. Now that it's known that the American government has done this once, at least, it essentially puts a seed of distrust into the American people, of those who would normally be like willfully or blissfully ignorant of what the government is doing and how their information is being used through across the internet, phone calls, anything among that nature, which is becoming more and more apparent nowadays with how you have companies that use your cookies and data to serve you ads, but the government is using this information and going into it without proper reason or warrant. And since the seed of distrust has been placed, it wouldn't be hard to imagine the government doing something like this again. Of course, especially after, say, instances like 9/11. There had to be some form of increased levels of security because the government's realizing they're essentially fighting an invisible enemy. But even if that's the case and that it's needed, it's still the government prying onto someone's information that shouldn't have been pried on to begin with, or it shouldn't have to the same degree, or it should have at least taken a bit more effort for the government to actually go through and obtain that information. Because at the end of the day, the government has its job, but its job is to serve the people. And if it's taking advantage of its people, then that's where the tensions will rise, where people are uncertain of what their own government's doing if they can truly trust them. In this case, there is a very important topic regarding the morals behind it, which is whistleblowing. Whistleblowing is the act of like a person within a company saying or realizing, hey, this company is doing something bad, and it possibly goes against their contract, and then taking this information to outside sources, such as with Snowden, where he took the information within the NSA and brought it out to outside sources to expose them for wrongdoings. But the main thing to understand with the morals behind it, is that it can either be a good or a bad thing. Whistleblowing can be a good thing in terms of exposing the wrongdoings of these companies, but in a sense, it can also be a bad thing because it can be a breach of contract or a breach of trust for the person in the company. So within many cases of whistleblowing, said worker won't be able to work at the place any longer and might have issues in future careers because there would be trust issues behind an employer trying to employ them. So usually whistleblowing can be a good thing, but it's a question of like how important is it and how many steps does that person take within it. Snowden, he went ahead and tried to address his findings to officials within the company, got nowhere with it, so he had to resort to going to an outside source. So in one sense, someone can say, hey, this is a breach of trust or a possible breach of contract, which in Snowden's case, he only took an oath regarding that he cannot go against the US Constitution, which he didn't because he was exposing the company itself, or I guess the NSA, for breaching the Fourth Amendment of people's right to privacy. So now the question is, what happened to Snowden? Like, what happened after he leaked these documents and spread this large amount of highly classified information? Because obviously, if he was to stay in America, there would be legal consequences. So what he ended up doing was he left for Hong Kong, like say a few days before the release of this data in 2013 to avoid the 30s, or to avoid the authorities. And then later he went to Moscow, where he ended up gaining Russian citizenship actually semi-recently in September 2022. So he hasn't actually faced any real legal charges regarding it. But if he used to go back to America, he would be charged with 2 counts of violating the Espionage Act of 1917 and the theft of government property by the United States Department of Justice, which makes sense in a sense as far as what he technically did, at least in the government's eyes. So realistically, he's never coming back to America, but he's still continuing with his fight for internet transparency for the people that go against their said governments, which enact strong restrictions or have power over the government and the companies within it that run the government. Because at the end of the day, the internet is made and run essentially by these large companies where they have control over who has access to it. Then, regarding the public opinion of Snowden, it's pretty mixed. Some can view him as a coward for leaving and running away from the country. Some view him as a traitor for releasing important information. But some also view him as a hero, as someone who's fighting for the rights of the American people, or just people around the world who deal with these governments that have strong control and have the power to deal with their internet and like what they view. If you're to say compare it to like a country like China, where there's obviously strong internet restrictions that the government uses to its own benefit. So taking this apart, Snowden had the right intent to leak this information because he believed that this information was the government overstepping their bounds and the people needed to know. But the scale at which he released this information becomes more of a consequence than a positive. Because the amount of information that he's released, this is all top secret American informational intelligence that is now there for the world to see. So Snowden had the right idea, but the amount of stuff he leaked was on a scale that was, say, uncalled for in a sense. I believe that Snowden was correct in exposing this information because at the end of the day, it's the government overstepping its bounds. The people need to know this. But he did it in a very extreme way in a sense. Because I think it would have been more important for him to do it in a more controlled manner that would have been less of a risk to the national security. Because at the end of the day, there is a balance between the American people knowing what the government is doing and the government being secret enough to keep its own people safe. And the other reason I kind of point out here is that this wasn't necessarily a matter of like life and death, unless you view privacy as that dramatic of a right to believe so, and I won't argue with that. But if you're to compare it to say, okay, a civil engineer working on a structure, and there's these safety protocols that aren't being followed, safety violations of the construction of the building that just keep being pushed and pushed along. So by the time the building's finished, maybe there's something wrong with its foundation or something at which there's structural integrity issues with it. And they know about this. And if that building collapses, people can genuinely die and get heavily injured from this. This wasn't necessarily on the same level because you just have information. It's information that has the possibility to hurt, but it isn't as blatant compared to a building falls and people die. So then the person who didn't whistleblow now feels terrible because they could have done something about that. Now, the counterpoint that someone could easily make on this is saying that this is like a requirement that people should genuinely know everything that their government is doing. But at the end of the day, the government is only a small portion of the 330 million people within America, and they need to keep their people safe and use their power as efficiently as possible. Another question that someone could go against and say, hey, Snowden shouldn't have released this information. Oh, this is top secret information that should not have been released, and what he has done is traitorous to America. And to that, I would ask, so he released this information. To you, is it more important to have security or privacy? Because this is what the balance is laying on. You can have more security, but the government knows everything about you, can have a full-on profile of you, whatever, and then they can take excessive steps towards you and your information. Or would you rather have privacy at which the government doesn't intervene whatsoever into your life and only does so when it absolutely needs to. Now that privacy thing is the thing I believe should be focused on for the balance, because the government shouldn't have full overreaching arms over people, because then we keep getting closer to this idea of a dystopia like Big Brother, where he knows everything that's going on and you're just kind of like living day to day, ignoring it in a sense or being blissfully ignorant about it. So to sum it up, I believe that Snowden was in the right to release this information, just on not as aggressive a scale as he did, and that the whistleblowing has its place in society where it helps to minimize the reach of these large institutions and the power that they have over people, such as the fact that these institutions have control over the workers' lives, and if the workers see something bad, they should obviously say something about it. And when it comes to this, where it's on the scale of a government worker in one of the, if not the most powerful nation in the world, this becomes very important in a weird balancing act of national security versus the people actually like getting their rights taken care of properly, following the US Constitution and the things that go alongside of it. To summarize this general presentation, look at the beginning. Edward Snowden, this guy who works as an NSA contractor, which is the National Security Agency, a government body that does a lot regarding national security, if that ain't obvious. And this guy, while working there, finds out about this information that the NSA is doing, at which they are overstepping their bounds in terms of trying to retrieve information from people's call data through Verizon. Knowing this, he goes ahead, leaves the country, leaks it to a couple of news medias. This blows up because a lot of he's releasing thousands upon thousands of documents that would normally be highly classified within the American government. This means that these documents pose a risk to American security since so much information is released. And it's found out within this that the American government's overstepping its bounds regarding the Fourth Amendment. So the question is, was Snowden right in doing so? And the second question is the American government right for overstepping its own bounds on the idea of safety versus privacy? Looking at the first question, Snowden had the right intent, but his execution was far too aggressive in the sense of the amount of information released was more of a risk than the actual like pros of it, which would be like, oh, American government did a bad thing. Now the people are going to be angry at it and want reform, which is not a bad thing in its own right. That's a good thing. American government is built upon its people. It's good for the people to know. But the risk involved is far more consequential, since when you look at it, the release of the information isn't just like, oh, someone blow the whistle on a civil engineering project such as a bridge, a tower, something like that, where it's found that it's structurally unstable or goes against certain safety violations. And if that building is completed and collapses, it can immediately cause deaths to people. This isn't as much of an immediate effect as it's more of just knowing that, oh, the government's looking into your personal information. If you're doing bad things, the government, and it might catch on quicker, which in one sense brings to one of the main points, which is security versus privacy. You can have very high security and very low privacy. But the privacy, there's a balance that needs to be had. Because at the end of the day, you take the security thing too much, it becomes like a whole Big Brother situation, where the government knows everything, can easily profile you, even though you're just a law-abiding citizen, going about your day, doing your 9 to 5, and so forth. Okay, so this ends the main portion of my presentation. The last slide will be regarding some references that I've used to find some general information regarding this, and thank you for watching. These are the references that I've used in the process of creating this presentation. And with that, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for watching it.